Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Executive Forum on Why Smart Buildings Virtual Executive Forum. And Matt just popped in. Hi, Matt. Navigating the New World, How the COVID-19 Crisis Has Strengthened the Case for Smart Buildings Practices and Technologies. There's a lot of material to discuss. And so in the interest of kind of getting as much of it in as possible and having time for questions, we're just gonna get started right away. So I'm going to start by welcoming and introducing our three panelists. Today we have Cara Carmichael. Cara is a principal with Rocky Mountain Institute's building practice, where she focuses on net zero energy and deep energy retrofits in the federal and commercial building sectors. The Rocky Mountain Institute, for those who aren't familiar, is an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit with a mission to transform global energy use to create a clean, prosperous, and secure low carbon future. So welcome, Cara. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Art Smith is a vice president of smart building services with DB Engineering. DB Engineering works with its clients to optimize their building systems and operations by integrating mechanical engineering fundamentals and data analytics. So welcome, Art. And Matt Golden, who has just joined us 30 seconds ago from another webinar that he was panelist in. So very popular guy. Matt is the CEO of Recurve, the company that developed the Open EE meter, an open source platform for measuring energy savings and load shape based on smart meter data. Recurve provides a scalable platform for measuring revenue grade demand flexibility, which is behind the meter energy efficiency, demand response, storage, and electric vehicles, using open source calculations, smart meter data, and parallel cloud computing. Matt is also a board member of the Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, the partner organization of the Smart Building Center. So welcome all of our panelists to today's discussion. My name is Carrie Mead. I'm the executive director of NEEC and of the Smart Building Center. Britton, if you want to advance to the next slide, I'll give a little quick intro to the Smart Building Center. So the Smart Building Center is a nonprofit organization with a mission to accelerate the commercialization of smart building technologies and practices. And we do this in three ways: educating the building workforce for the future, demonstrating smart technologies and practices in our space and also in the community through building tours and site visits, with public groups, and then connecting the industry through hosting events and participating in local and national discussions like this one. Next slide, Britton. The Smart Building Center is staffed by through a partnership between the Northwest Energy Efficiency Council and the Smart Building Center Education Program, which is a separate organization with its own board. So the NEEC folks are the ones who staff all of the work that the SBC is doing. And our work is sponsored by a variety of organizations and partners who are listed on the slide. Okay, and so just to keep going with things, Cara, Art, and Matt are going to have a few minutes to kind of intro a little bit more about themselves and what they're thinking about in regard to this the topic at hand. And then we'll dive into questions. There will be some time at the end for some Q&A. We're going to work really hard to maintain that. But if you do have questions as they come up, you can feel free to submit them through the little box where there should be a space to ask a question. And Britton will be fielding those, and we will get them to our panelists at the end. And panelists, I know in our prep call there was some discussion. If you're interested in being interrupted during the discussion, then let us know and we'll let that happen. Otherwise, we'll preserve it all for the end. Okay, so you're up, Cara.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Carrie, for setting us up and organizing this today. I was actually just reflecting on our new mode of virtual working, and at RMI we have this thing. This is thank you, so everybody can visually thank each other. So thank you. So next slide, please. What I'd like to touch on today is really smart buildings and the impacts they can have on the grid. And I've been leading a lot of our work around grid interactive efficient buildings, and I see them as synonymous with smart buildings. And what a grid interactive building really is it's a building that uses smart technologies and on-site DERs, distributed energy resources, to provide demand flexibility. And this happens under the auspice of co-optimizing for energy cost, grid services, and occupant needs and preferences. So we're taking all three of those factors into account in a continuous and integrated way. So what this really means, definition aside, is it's buildings that have the ability to merge efficiency, renewable energy, load flexibility, energy storage, those four key components. And down the road, or even today, electrification, I think, is another key thread that's just not here. So what this looks like in practice, the graph on here is a load profile. You'll see the baseline energy use in red. When you apply efficiency, it just drops that curve, drops the demand and energy use of that curve. When you introduce demand flexibility, it reshapes that curve based on different signals. So you can see in the background of this, the gray bars represent an emissions profile for that grid and building over the course of the day. And the yellow line shows that we're pushing our load into different parts of the day when the emissions profile on the grid is less. So next slide. So that ability to flex your load is really important, and that benefit spans different stakeholder groups. In terms of building owners, this is a tremendous source of savings, both today and it's a future-proof mechanism as rate structures change, the grid changes as we move into the future. So it reduces your utility bills. It can be a potential source of income by providing ancillary services, and it can increase resilience in your building, which reduces downtime, increases NOI, tenant satisfaction. Demand flexibility and grid interactive buildings help the grid run more smoothly because we're shifting that demand. We can help also reduce peak loads on the grid. It adds diversity and resilience. One of the things RMI is really focused on is demand flexibility is essential for system-wide decarbonization. So this really, we see buildings as the linchpin to that decarbonized future because buildings are the largest load on the electricity grid. And so if we can flex that load, we can help decarbonize a utility sector and incorporate more variable renewable energy into the grid. And it also brings solutions forth in the most cost-effective manner in terms of building and vehicle electrification. Next slide. So I think for the purposes of today's conversation, I just wanted to put a little bit of framing forth as to how we've been approaching the topic. There's several big kind of buckets that the impacts that COVID has had falls into. People, buildings, grid, and system level impacts. And just to kind of highlight a few that are top of mind for us, the health focus in buildings and the social distancing focus in buildings. I think that's going to lead to more future solutions around building electrification, different ventilation requirements in buildings as we start to reoccupy, especially commercial spaces. I think the social distancing, it's bringing about a lot of different changes and probably at this point more questions than answers as to what's going to happen in commercial spaces. We're looking at different office layouts, different remote working, different ways that we interact with our colleagues. So there's some big changes there that we'll talk a little bit more about. I think on the grid side, a big, a generalization is that we're seeing more weekend-like profiles, and we're seeing a lot of diversity, and I'm sure Matt will touch on this a little bit, as to how utilities in different grids are reacting to different levels of shutdown. And one thing for me that this highlights is, irregardless of how things shape out in the future, the need for smarter buildings and the need for demand flexibility is essential, not only from a grid perspective, but also to reduce costs for building owners. And I think there are some other system implications that we'll touch on a little bit more that weave these all together. I guess the last thing I'd like to add in introduction is our work is really important, and this conversation that we're having today and all the work that you guys are doing is really important from a climate and health perspective. But it's also really important from the racial equity side of the discussion. And I'd encourage us all to think about that more, talk about it more. And I think one direct intersection that I often reflect on, we're doing a lot of work in New York, and there's a distinct and negative and racially disproportionate health impact that's caused by some of the city's peaker plants. And so as we look to decarbonization solutions, that will in turn have significant health benefits and economic benefits, not only to low income areas, but also racially diverse areas.
Thanks, Cara. Art, it's your turn to introduce yourself.
Hello, and thank you everybody for being here today, and I appreciate it, Cara, being invited to be on the panel, Carrie. And I love the fact that Cara is hitting this on a very high level from my perspective. We're down in the weeds as DB Engineering, working day to day with operators on how to improve their facilities and day-to-day operations. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes just to give you a little feel for where I'm coming from as part of the panel. DB Engineering, a lot of the people in the Northwest, or particularly in the Seattle area, know DB Engineering as the third-party mechanical consultant for Microsoft. We started 20 years ago as that Doug Bloom. And over the last few years, we've grown from that into working with not just the largest software company in the world. We now work with the largest search, largest energy, largest retailer in the world. And we also happen to have people on the ground at the largest building, office building in the world. So we've been really, really fortunate to work with some of the leaders that are really trying to push smart building technologies to improve their occupants' environment. And it's largely started as an energy play, and it's turning into an occupant experience opportunity in smart buildings. And we did an exercise over the last month or so looking at our branding and things like that. And what I did is I took that document and I put it into a word cloud. And these are the words that popped out as most prolific in our discussions about who we are, why we exist, why we do what we do. And we really do create a specific custom client-based solution typically. We are an independent engineering consulting technology firm that is not connected to any particular product in any specific product. So we try to help Sherpa our clients through the wild west of smart buildings right now. There's a lot going on. And so I threw this up, just some of the things we focus on. We're engineers, scientists, problem solvers fundamentally, and we've integrated that with data skills. And working with large amounts of data requires skills way beyond what Excel will give us. So we have a lot of our engineers are now Python, SQL coders, and they work with data and can manipulate data in ways to learn, create insights and opportunities for building owners to take advantage of. So next slide. And the way that happens is all over the place right now, but it is happening. And I want people to understand that there's third-party manufacturers or third-party software solutions out there that do provide all of these components and pieces, but essentially we're taking data from building controllers and sensors, bringing that to a common point. It might be in the cloud, it might be on-prem, and analyzing it to create insights and visualize problems that we're able to help the operator focus on and prioritize. And that takes all kinds of parts and pieces to put it all together. And right now, it's a huge, huge opportunity. I believe this is a real turning point in the building industry to be able to harness data on an hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute basis. And I think this is a revolutionary technology that's going to be prolific in the next few years. So from DB Engineering's perspective, we believe, like Cara was saying, that the smart buildings are a big part of the grid solution. We think that this particular level of detail is what's required in order to get those buildings working better. And I think smart buildings are overdue in their time to come to market. And I think it's cost effective today, and we work with lots of clients that can show that every day. And that's kind of the position I'll be coming from when Carrie's asking the questions.
Thank you, Art. Matt, did you want to do some intro as well?
Sure. I neglected to forward on slides. I do have some I could share if necessary, but I actually don't think so, because I'm kind of pigeonholed right between Cara and Art in a good way, actually. So I'll forgo the slides, because Cara, you covered all the big picture stuff that I would probably be in the first of my 7 or 8 slides or something to begin with. So there's overall trends that I think we're all aware of as, broadly speaking, we move towards renewables and decarbonization at a pretty unpredicted clip, actually. You know, it's not a red or blue thing. If you look, there's a pretty interesting map, a decarbonization map that SEPA puts out, and it's all over the country. You know, it's something like closing in on 70% of Americans buy power from a utility that has a GHG goal, right? So this is no longer some, like, you know, lefty sidelined idea. This is all over the place. And so, you know, our position in the market, I actually initially ran a company that retrofitted buildings and found that all of the cards were stacked against us, and that utility programs actually made our lives harder, not better, and frankly, most importantly, less profitable, but not more. So we're focused on essentially tapping into that value. So we talk about grid integrated buildings and responsive buildings that can actually really 2 things. One is, can we help customers with health, safety, and lower energy costs on their retail bills? But that actually only reflects a fraction of the grid value, which is much more complicated and dynamic, especially when you start talking about GHGs, where things actually vary quite a bit based on where you are on the grid and when you use energy. And the complicated, it's complicated, right? And that doesn't really show up in retail rates, nor really should it. So we kind of mentioned in the intro, we focus on these open source tools, but the fundamental thing we're doing is measuring, regardless of what you did in a building, whether it is insulation, IoT, charging a car, or battery in the garage, we're pretty much agnostic. What we're focused on is, how did you change demand in that building relative to the forecast? And even more important than that, how did you do that across a portfolio of buildings that, frankly, to the grid looks like a virtual power plant, right? Not individual buildings, mileage may vary, but you get them into a bucket and they look very, very consistent and reliable. You can forecast them, you can finance them, you can even insure them. And so how do we get a market signal? I mean, we have a pretty clear, specific idea as a company that the utilities are not going to control everybody's toaster ovens directly in their smart home of the future, that we think smart companies like Arts and many others will build business models that will interpret that complicated signal and, you know, make my house sing and be awesome and comfortable and amazing and cheap for me, but also responsive to grid needs. And those things are tied together, because the best deal for the end customer is the one that makes them comfortable and reduces their bills, but is also optimized to deliver demand reduction during peaks and when carbon is the most intense on the grid, and all of these other kind of non-mutual benefits, right? These are things that benefit the utility, not the end customer. So why should the end customer pay for all of it? So we're really focused on setting up those markets, and what that comes down to is helping utilities identify which end customers are the ones that actually have valuable opportunities behind their meter. You know, not everyone's created equal. We're going to do HVAC efficiency. If you use a lot of air conditioning and that happens to coincide with the system peak, you're a much more valuable candidate than someone who might not, for example. So, you know, our role in this is helping utilities look at their population data first and understand, often for the first time, where exactly is their peak coming from, which customer classes and what end uses, and how much potential is there to deal with it. But then instead of potentially, I mean, many of them still run programs, but more and more they're saying, and cool, there's this whole universe of amazing new innovative business models out there. We're finding new cool stuff daily. Maybe we're not going to invent the Tesla or the Nest or the solar lease. Maybe we're going to engage and send a signal and let companies compete and come up with the business models that actually scale. So that's kind of our philosophical bend in all of this, but we create those markets, or at least enable them, and then let everyone else go out and invent the business models that are going to scale. COVID is an interesting wrinkle in a number of cases, particular to how we measure everything, right? There is no deemed savings anymore. Average rebates are just nonsense now, right? They're based on the past, and the future is not the past anymore. You can't even really do M&B at a site anymore because where's your baseline? What are you measuring against? So we see a lot of diversity out there and a lot of complexity, and it can be managed, but it's a data problem. And so the world of averages are more or less over. And so we look at classes of buildings, and non-essential businesses might have gone down by 60%, but that's not actually the case. What you're seeing is a distribution, and some of them went up by 10% over here, and a bunch of them are at 0. So you can't treat every beauty salon the same, right? Same thing with like equity issues. We see low-income customers are having their bills go up by a greater percentage than market rate customers. Maybe it's 10%. Doesn't seem that atrocious, except when you peel it apart, you realize, well, 10% of the customers are going up by 80%, and they're not going to be able to, afford groceries this month because of that. Equity is not an average. So how do we utilize this kind of insight and information to figure out where we can be most effective, maximize the return on those public investments, whether that's capacity or equity, but how do we get the most out of the money? How do we focus our efforts where it's going to have the biggest impact? And ultimately, how do you also measure it where you can't use a historical baseline anymore, which is a conundrum, actually. It's a solvable conundrum, but we got to think different. The usual tools aren't going to work anymore.
Okay, well, thank you, each of you, for that intro. I find each of you to be inspiring. The work you're doing is important, and the conversation was taking place before, 3 months ago when we all, retreated to our homes for the pandemic, and the conversation is going to continue. Today, we're focusing on the impacts of what we've been experiencing the last few months for this conversation that we're collectively having. So I'm going to dive into some questions. When you think about the dramatic behavioral changes, and some of you have touched on this a little already, in place over the last several months, what strikes you as most relevant to those working in clean energy, energy efficiency, and the built environment? And so, Cara, I'm going to ask you first.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that there are a couple things that come to mind. I think from a global perspective, the International Energy Agency, IEA, released a report in April. You guys may have seen it, but it was a little bit of the doom and gloom, but it was also, there's a really powerful silver lining, I think, and that was that renewables were the only source of energy that posted a growth in demand over this first quarter of the year. And they're projecting that renewable electricity generation will continue to grow throughout the year at nearly 5%, despite some of the supply chain and construction delays that COVID is causing. So I think that's a really powerful signal to the industry and to the investment community. Coal and oil demand are down 8% and 5% respectively, and I was listening to a story on NPR yesterday with some oil executives, and they're not entirely sure that they'll ever rebound to the peak that they were seeing pre-COVID. So I think that shows kind of really solid and global market shifts that are at play and rapidly accelerating because of COVID. I think my second thought really is, and much closer to home, is that we're all spending a ton more time in our homes, right? I mean, we're here. Estimates have said that like this April, 62% of employed Americans worked at home. And I think in the US, we're fairly fortunate in that, oftentimes, for the most part, it's cleaner. Like we have fairly good air outside. And some research by EPA is emerging showing that the levels of indoor air quality is actually becoming worse than outdoor air quality, especially in homes that have combustion burning inside the home. So this is natural gas fired space heating, water heating, and especially cooking. And EPA has shown that there could be between 2 to 5 times commonly and as much to 100 times higher indoor air pollution than outdoor air pollution. And so I think that points really strong signals, as we are spending so much time at home. We should potentially be thinking about what fuel sources we have in our house and electrification. And electrification is beneficial not only from a health perspective, getting that combustion out of our space, but also from a grid perspective, because it enables us to, as the grid gets cleaner, we have more electric sources that are also getting cleaner with it, as well as it impacts load flexibility, we have more load to shift. So I think that's kind of another important trend that I wanted to highlight.
Cara. Art.
Yes. Our clients, it was interesting to see when everybody was sent home, we had probably well over 100 million square feet of client activity in flight that we were helping them monitor, analyze, optimize. And all of a sudden we needed to make a 90-degree or 180-degree turn and shut those buildings down. And it was a really interesting thing to see our clients take advantage and leverage the investments that they had made over, some of them for 7 or 8 years had been investing in smart building technologies to get data to be able to have insights that other people didn't. And what we saw was the incredible ability to turn back and save hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is all of that grid reduction, all of that greenhouse gas reduction, some of that we've seen in these buildings that I think it was really powerful. And when we look back at what the tools that our clients were able to leverage, it was a really powerful statement, and it's a great case study. What's happening now, though, over the last couple of weeks is people are starting just now to say, okay, we want to have our building ready by then for 25% or 50%. And we're starting to see the other side of this problem, which is operators go back to running things the way they used to, not the way their new building standards are driven by their company's standards. So we're seeing operators struggling slightly with the idea of, hey, you just can't run it on a demand control ventilation strategy anymore. Those things are turned off, and people don't even know what demand control ventilation was in the previous life before COVID, and now they're struggling trying to figure out how not to use it or to use it more effectively. Anyway, so it's really interesting to see the challenges that our clients are going through, and we're able to help them through the data and basically have more insights and more vision. And I think this is going to be a great case example of diversity and challenges are more easily overcome with investments in smart building technologies.
Thanks, Art. And Matt?
Once again, this isn't really fair. If I come in third, everything gets covered basically before I get here. I mean, again, it's just kind of like, this is an opportunity also, because, an awful lot, the legacy of like energy efficiency and what we've all been doing with many of us anyways with our careers, like things are changing, and it's an opportunity to embrace that change. In many aspects of the industry that we're in, we need disruption. We need to kind of to wipe the slate clean. There's a whole bunch of the stuff that we do that has legacies going back 40 or 50 years that just don't make sense anymore. And that's not a failure, that's an opportunity, but it's really hard to pivot this ship. And so it's going to be painful, but the opportunity is to realign around where we're going in the future, which, I think we'll see how, obviously health and those sorts of issues are going to only be more important going forward in this COVID season. We'll see how long people remember. I'm not always so sure in that regard, how long people's memories are. But yeah, and thinking outside of the box, we're in this weird world now where you can definitely save energy in California, frankly, increasingly other parts of the country too. The time will vary where you're not saving carbon and you are creating costs to ratepayers. So we're now in a world where energy efficiency is not always a good thing, which is new, right? So just thinking much more creatively, tying it all together. We actually agree that electrification is really complicated. Like New York's a good example. Like maybe they're gonna have a winter morning peak that might be twice as big as their summer current ramp peak, which means we got to insulate a lot of attics, most valuable attic. So just these things are all tied together. You got to, building science isn't going anywhere. But thinking about where the future, this is an opportunity, this is going to way overuse analogy, but like time to run to where the ball's going, right? And I think it's pretty clear where that ball's going over time. Now, the next couple of years are going to be pretty dicey getting there, though. So, and one of the things we like about electrification, by the way, is like you can pretend that utilities don't make money by selling electrons, but that's pretend. They do. Even though it's rate based at zero, it's not really how it works. So one of the beautiful things about electrification is they actually make money. If you electrify and build load at the right times during the day, it makes them money. And you don't need some strange regulatory paradigm on the back end to try to make them whole. They actually make money at it. And so frankly, that's the thing that we're most excited about electrification is they actually profit from it. And it's way easier to make everybody do stuff that is profitable overall.
So Matt, you have teed up my next questions, and since you complained about going third, I'm going to let you go first. We'll switch the order.
No, I was saying it's really easy.
Okay, well, too bad for you. You brought it up. So when you think about, quote, going back to normal, we're all hearing this return to normalcy. Does anything about that concern you? What kind of stands out about that idea?
Well, it's just gonna be a rolling thing. There is no normal. We're gonna have a new normal. Like at some point we'll recalibrate and plateau. Like there'll be a new normal, but we're years away from that. So again, can't use averages. People are talking in terms of the commercial sector and the residential sector, but we're looking in terms of every single NACE code and the distribution. And so like our biggest problem, like averages are done, they were done a long time ago actually, but like the world we lived in, which again, this is this legacy of like, we had no data. So we built models and decided every time you install a heat pump, you got an average outcome. There is no average, right? There might be one average actually. You'll get a distribution, someone might be in the middle, but everyone else is on one side or the other. So, the recovery is not gonna be on average, So if you look at a sector and say, oh, this sector is 82% recovered, let's go do some efficiency on it. But if you target the buildings that are still at 21%, which 10 or 15% of them will be, or whatever, right? You're not going to get any good outcome. You're not going to get the outcomes. So we just got to, and this is also the biggest opportunity for everything we do as well, because the flip side is that when you deem an average, which again, deemed averages, not everyone's realized this, but it's over, right? Like they don't work anymore. But so we got to treat everyone like an individual. We can't use broad brush strokes. But that's also the opportunity, because you find the customers that actually have the crappy HVAC systems, or, a lot of potential for BMS or whatever the controls are that you're installing are. And those non-average customers, the one with the most potential, will usually double or triple the average in the first place. And so, so the opportunity here is that we've been squawking about how averages and models are the death knell of everything we do, because the average doesn't tend to pencil, but the marginal best 20% does pencil. So let's go do that first. And I think that is now a flat out requirement in COVID, because there is no average.
Okay.
I think what you're talking about, Matt, is really like the signals that we're sending. And I think, as we start to emerge from this, like one of the signals that's on everyone's mind is cost. Like, from a residential perspective, there are hundreds that may not be able to pay their utility bills. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people can't pay their utility bills, and they're coming up on summer. And so in commercial buildings, demand charges can make up to 60% of the costs of your utility bills. And so I think that emphasizes this need for flexibility. If cost is the signal that we optimize around today, we need flexibility, and flexibility has been proven to provide financial benefits under today's rate structures, even though we're not to the point where we're shifting load based on grid emissions and grid needs. Like even if we as building owners shift loads based on cost, we can save money today because demand charges make up such a big portion. I think there's some philosophical conversations, that could happen on how we better align those signals, if it's kind of a cap and trade or if it's more kind of baked into utility rates. But I think the bottom line is that smart buildings and load flexibility can save money.
And Art, did you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I really hope like hell we don't go back to normal. because normal was really pretty bad. We find that, Matt, when you talk about the heat pump profile, it goes like this, not if you don't shut it off. And, scheduling as an example, we find a lot of clients that just don't know that their equipment's running all night. We know that outside air dampers don't work right. We know that, the cooling system and the heating system isn't working properly. And I got to think that there's such a large percentage of buildings right now that aren't functioning as well as the operators believe they are, that is one of the biggest problems that we're going to have going back into buildings, is the feeling of security and safety, knowing that my systems are all up to snuff or doing what they're supposed to do. And our experience and what we've noticed is when you go into a building, there's a fairly good percentage that have scheduling issues, ventilation and outside air issues, and cooling system and heating system issues that are really low-hanging fruit for, I hate using that phrase all the time, but it is rampant. So my fear of normal is that it's not going to cut it. If there's no going back to where we were, in my opinion. I think there's going to be too much scrutiny on how we operate facilities, and we got away with it before, and I don't think we're going to get away with it anymore.
Okay, so Art, you have teed up the next question. As buildings reopen, can smart technologies help us better manage crises going forward?
Yeah, we're already seeing it right now, and I'll hit this one out of the park because we've got a client in Canada. They've got 30 buildings across the country that they just started bringing them back on a couple of weeks ago, and we did see the operators, and that was that example I was giving. The operators went back to running things the way they were. In the interim, over the last 3 months, they came out with a whole new guideline of how they wanted to operate their buildings. And now we have operators that have to learn a whole new way to run their buildings to be in not necessarily compliance, but meet the intent of ASHRAE and the recommendations of the industry. And I think we're going to see there's a lot of opportunity for the people who have their smart buildings in place and are getting their data to use that data to make sure that they are adhering to the new strategies. And we're picking it up already. We're helping those clients. Hey, yeah, you're not running that the way it was supposed to. Here's the way we're supposed to run that now. And that was just in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, we've started to see that kind of an opportunity. So I do believe that coming out of this, it's going to be the people who know what's going on in their systems and have the smartest buildings will do the best.
Cara?
I think Art is right on. You hit it out of the park, like you said. I think smart building, like smart control systems, are really where our industry needs to head. And unfortunately, there's not enough kind of scale and uptake of that ability to shift loads as we need. And I think to Matt's previous point, like efficiency is no longer the end goal. I think it's kind of a really important leverage point that makes demand flexibility and electrification and all these kind of system attributes more cost effective. And I think that having smart controls in our buildings can help foster that ultimate vision that we want to see. So yeah. I see this, re-emergence from COVID as it is an opportunity. And I think we like to frame it in terms of triggers, like building triggers. And this is, if you have, so stepping back a little bit, we need to, in order to curb climate change impacts, we have 10 years to kind of turn the ship. To do that, we need to retrofit or build all of our we need to retrofit half of every building in the US to zero carbon, and we need to build every single new construction to zero carbon in the next 10 years. Just buildings have such a slow capacity, capital cycle that gives us one chance in each building, to really go in and do a major retuning, rethinking, system replacement. And so I would encourage everyone, as we're rethinking what offices of the future will look like and what this new normal could be, what what that means in terms of a larger decarbonization effort. And if it's a 0 over time plan where you're kind of doing load reduction measures now and controls and recommissioning in advance of a major equipment replacement that you know is coming down the road, that's great. If you think you can focus it all now while when tenants are not in the building and kind of put that plan in place now and build increased resilience, that's great. But I think this little bit of pause gives us a strategic advantage of how we want to invest in our buildings and what we want that asset to be in the future.
Yeah, obviously Art hit the key points here. I would say we're actually attacking like very much the same points. I actually use economizers as my joke usually. Like what we're finding at a population level is like, well, a good example is like if you look at the California deer load shapes, the average load shapes, there's this you look at them actually say like, oh, commercial buildings don't have a lot of potential at all. They use energy in the middle of the day. They're kind of the wrong timing, which has led to like bypassing them as a climate solution. Because on average, that's actually true that like they do generally use energy at the wrong time. But what we're looking at that then feeds into the actual building retrofit itself and what is the precise problem with that building, which we don't claim to know from outer space, right, from our data. But you look at all the buildings, like we're just doing this for East Bay Community Energy in Oakland. There's actually a webinar, you can see some of the stuff. But so the conventional wisdom, and you talk to the regulator and they're like, nah, commercial buildings, they're not very useful. There's a peak plant, but it's peak. Commercial buildings aren't gonna help. We look at the actual data and we go, well, actually, on average, right, but 20% of the buildings exactly coincide with the peak, and that's a ton of buildings. It's not nothing, like the average might be totally wrong, but 20%, that's gonna take us the next, I'm sorry, unfortunately, decade plus to hit the 20%. I'm not as optimistic we're getting to 0 in 10 years, unfortunately. Not that I don't want it to happen, but I'm with you, but I don't know how the math works yet. But that's huge. Go after those 20%. And then we look at them and be like, all right, and these are the ones with temperature dependent load, which is code for HVAC. And I can't tell you if they have disconnected ducts or a broken economizer, Art can, but go knock on those doors first because they're super, super valuable to the customer and the grid, which means you can give them a screaming deal and they're gonna have a great ROI. And then Art can show up and figure out how to put on controls and like put the chain back on the economizer.
Okay, so given all of the discussion, everything that's been happening, with all we've experienced and learned over the last few months and the last few weeks and day to day, do you think this is going to change our industry? And if so, how?
I think it's going to accelerate the change that was painfully but already happening. Like, on the energy efficiency front, EE budgets, if you look at on the utility front, it might not change Art's business, but accelerate it. But if you think about it as a broader, like decarbonization, who's going to pay for it business, like the change is already happening. Traditional efficiency programs lost 18% over the last 24 months. Like the change is happening. This is a solution. And so now we just need to like take advantage of this crisis and disruption to get on the rails.
Yeah. I think there are two exciting kind of themes coming out of COVID. If it's probably very inappropriate to put those two words in the same sentence.
We understand
that. I think that there are two things that we can really take away from this crisis. I think globalization of ideas is the first, and the cost of inaction is the second. And in terms of the globalization premise, like we can't go it alone. And that's very clear from kind of a pandemic perspective. But I think it's also clear from a buildings perspective. Our supply chains are inextricably linked across and around the world. And so embodied carbon is a big driver that I think is under addressed and under discussed and undervalued in today's conversation. And it contributes to 11% of our global emissions in buildings. That's particularly stark in concrete and steel contributions. I think, we need to also harness the globalization of globalization and harness good ideas and share those. And one example is the Energy Strong method from the Netherlands. And they're creating this panelized zero energy retrofit solution that can be installed in 2 weeks And it's an envelope panel. They have a mechanical pod that comes in, and it can, over there, they have financing in place so that it's all kind of an on-bill finance, zero upfront cost. So we're trying to import some of those models to the US, and they do great things for supply chains, customization, quality. A lot of good ideas are coming out of there. I think one note to highlight on the cost of inaction, and this is directly geared at kind of flattening the curves, but as we approach thinking of resilience, NIBS, the National Institute of Building Sciences, released a report a year or so ago about the cost of inaction in preparedness for natural disasters. And they found that for every dollar that you invest pre-disaster, that manifests in $6 of avoided cost post-disaster to rebuild or fix things that are broken. And so I think, and that actually has flowed through. FEMA is now apportioning a percentage of their budget to like preventative measures. So I think that's something that we should take to heart in our buildings as well.
I'm going to throw a word of caution in this period of stimulus, which is learn from the, let me start with this, remember the recent past. So, you know, I think in this effort to like think about the future of this industry differently than the past potentially, you know, I think we want to avoid going through what we just did with the Recovery Act, you know, less than a decade ago, which was this rinse and repeat that we've been on of like a pretty similar set of core ideas around, you know, we want to see products move, so we're going to provide rebates and we're going to pay consultants and local governments and folks to do marketing to end customers and train the industry. All of which forgetting that there's the fundamentals of the market, which is businesses need to make money, and you know, the challenge being that you know many of these things actually don't make people money historically. So taking this opportunity to really think about means that leverage the private sector, because that's where the capital and the innovation have to come from, and focus on making sure that customers are getting a better deal when they do the right thing for the climate, for et cetera. But also that the industry and companies like ART make more money, not less, when they pursue and manage to deliver public policy goals. And that sounds kind of obvious, but I don't know, in California, in efficiency, 43% of every dollar spent on commercial buildings goes to program overhead. And most of the things those programs do, and I'm looking at ART here, nobody actually wants the penalties. I don't know how many, do you like sending your twos to you know, multiple days of training and all? So we need to think differently. And I have some general concerns that like we're marching down with the same people leading it, but like a very similar set of ideas. I'm actually personally I've been thankful over the last few years that finally some of the programs established by the Recovery Act have kind of fallen by the wayside because they were never economically sustainable, so they distorted the market. So I have actually a lot of concern that our stimulus is going to reinstate those non-sustainable or scalable business models and kind of be more fodder for the consultant class, when what we really need is strong innovation and private investment from companies in the marketplace. You know, the Teslas, the Nets, and the Solar Lease did not come from a government program. That came out of brutal competition in the market. So, you know, just getting those fundamentals right. You know, if you really can't force businesses to lose money, no matter how hard you try. So, you know, to me, that's first. You know, then we can do training and stuff. That's great, but like, you know, it's not going to work if you don't actually make a profit. That's actually my thing with heat pumps. They'd be like, why aren't people doing heat pumps? Well, you make more money not doing a heat pump as an installer. Like, it's really, that's the core thing. I do it. I install a fancy heat pump, I'm gonna have a whole bunch of brain damage, an electrical contractor, and I'm gonna make less profit. So like, kind of nothing you're gonna like until that's fixed. You're not really gonna push anybody around. Anyway, just think that's a specific point. Focusing on those fundamentals, right? Has to make money. Has to be a better deal to the customer, not a worse deal.
I would push back just a little bit though. Sorry, Carrie.
We can try this one, but I'm an HVAC contractor. I've done this before. I have the economics. I know what the consultants say, but I'm an HVAC contractor.
I think though it's also a little bit of the chicken and the egg, that we need to build and educate the workforce so that we can deliver some of these technologies.
So chicken and egg though, like someone's got to lay the egg. Like no amount of, I mean, because we've done this so many times, like training the workforce, it's pushing a string up the hill. You don't, you know, demand doesn't follow supply. Supply follows demand, right? You gotta, so like, I don't know. In my experience, none of that actually works. And we lived through it. And because the economics are like, we're just terrible at it. Like I can give you the advanced home upgrade program in California. And frankly, efficiency is an easier sell than electrification because like it's easier for people.
Yeah.
But if you look at the actual money we spent on marketing and you divided it by if you said half of the program participants came from that marketing, which I think it's 5% or less if you really did, but let's give them half. We spent $30,000 a customer on that marketing. And so I don't know. I just think we have it backwards. We have this idea that if we do a marketing campaign and we train a bunch of people for jobs that have yet to exist, and we do like that, then this market will manifest. I think it's the opposite, where like we make this something that an HVAC installer and a manufacturer say, wow, I can make money in that, and then they enter the market, and then we train them because it's profitable. And then I think you have a hope of being successful. But again, it's really, really hard. You know, people are wondering like, why contractors aren't showing up. I'm having these conversations in California, and I'm like, they're not crazy. Like, first of all, nobody believes this public policy stuff. You know, say, oh, we decarbonize in 10 years, but we're supposed to be at 40% reduction in residential efficiency by 2020, by the way, right? Like, it's gone up. Like, no, you know, and I don't know, like smart companies don't bet on public policy because it's never actually come out like that.
Okay.
And so we gotta make the market work first.
So this is a good discussion, getting a little into the details, Matt.
But it's a COVID thing. Like as we recover from COVID, we got to focus on the core economics as like the thing, right? Like it's got to be smart for customers, be smart for businesses to actually do the right thing, or it's really probably not going to happen.
That's a good segue. Oh,
can I throw 2 cents? I'll make it really quick. I believe we got to follow the science, and I think we need to leverage the data. And this is a consultant talking, Matt, I know, but it's what we have right now.
That's why I can batter the consultant class because I am one too. So I've been on the other side of it.
So, but my belief right now, though, is what we're doing with COVID is trying to leverage the science or follow the science and leverage the data. What we're doing with buildings is comfort and lights. And that is what we live for when we build a building, is to make people comfortable in whatever they're doing and give them some light. Literally, those things need to be evaluated. We need to follow that science. We can tell you right now on a building how comfortable it is with the sensors that are out there. We can tell you every building that's not comfortable. We know that 90% of people don't find their buildings comfortable. It's a shame. And that science and data will change what's happening, just like coming out of COVID. So anyway, I just throw that out.
No, that was fair, and that was a good addition to the discussion. We just have a few minutes left. As you know, I have one more question for you guys, and I'm going to offer this also to the audience. So if you are interested in just submitting your thoughts, there'll be a recording of this presentation that'll be available, and we can also share questions with our panelists after the fact if there are things that you were hoping to have covered. So to the three of you, a very quick answer. So hopefully we can get to 1 or 2 audience questions. And audience, feel free to chime in. Is there any practical advice you'd like to offer? So specific things that people can do right now, and maybe you've already covered it because we did get into some of the specific things, Matt. It was very specific about a few things. Lessons we should apply to our current activities. I'll go first to Art.
Leverage your data.
And Cara.
I'd say planning is cheap, implementation is expensive, so take this time to get a good plan in place for decarbonization.
Matt.
Solution sell. We're just finding that like some of our old assumptions don't really apply. So like talk to your customers and dig around and figure out what their new pains are, because they might not look like their old ones. Like probably not that worried about energy bills when you're at 40% capacity, but they need to get people back. Like don't assume the way you sold last year is the way you're going to sell going forward. Find pain, and I don't mean that sounds terrible, but that's a sales word. Scratch around, figure out where people, and they're, you know, and there's some new stuff, there's some new opportunities there, like
Okay.
reposition.
So Britton, if you are still there, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we actually have quite a few great questions, so it's going to be hard to pick just a couple here. But I'll start with, this is kind of a two-part question, but I'll just go ahead and read it as one. So does the industry have the capacity to adjust the building operations to meet the new and changing needs of buildings? And then separately, should utilities be shifting their incentive focus to updating operations to maximize efficiency under these new operating requirements? And with that, how do we measure savings?
Just a little question there. Is anyone feeling very confident in a response?
Well, I know from our experience, not all the systems are going to be capable of managing the new COVID operating conditions. And from the savings perspective and the extra energy that's going to be consumed, we have to start looking at it differently. I think Matt's been hitting on that. The averages of before don't apply anymore. And so we do need to shift our thinking on how much better than where you should be operating, how much worse are you from what you should be doing. It's going to take a while to get back to what is good benchmarking.
We're on the benchmarking and the M&V part. If you go on our website, you'll see some of it. We're doing some work with that is funded by a federal agency. We're not quite allowed to say yet, not that it's some big secret, but something still has to be signed. But doing some research with a bunch of population level data on what a benchmark is and how you do M&V. You know, the entire notion of measuring, you have to have something to measure against, right? And the challenge, of course, with measuring stuff behind meters in buildings is that once you've changed the building, you don't have anything left to measure against. So from our research to date, like, you know, again, deemed averages are done. Sooner we just accept that, like, the better. Like, you can't, maybe in 3 or 4 years we'll have a new deemed average, but to date, like, they just don't exist anymore. And then frankly, you know, doing traditional building level M&V, you have this significant, you know, trying to treat this like a non-routine event doesn't really work either. This is like the mother of all events, right? So you can't just go in, because again, what you're doing at the end of the day is you're making a bunch of assumptions that can't be tested. You're just writing your own thing. There's no way, like, you can't validate any of it. So there is this process that, like, a kind of a public process to work on some of these methods. We have some large scale data behind it to actually test them, but we are finding that we can benchmark and we can measure when using population data by creating comparison groups and, you know, matching on sectors and locations and recovery rates. So you're comparing similar buildings to create some benchmarking capabilities, but they can't really be applied at an individual asset level anymore. And so this is like pretty fundamental stuff that we need, that I think there's, you know, people are starting to think about, but like, it all just changed, right? Like, and it is possible though, but the rules have changed. You know, we have to be using comparison groups, and we have to be thinking about populations, not individuals, in order to really know what our outcomes are. So new challenges, I don't know, but it is doable.
Cara, did you want to add something on this?
I think they've covered it.
Okay, let's take one more question.
Okay, and this one is specifically for Art. What are the top things on your checklist for operator actions as they repopulate their commercial buildings?
Yeah, we created a white paper that I'll send out on my LinkedIn, and if anybody wants to see that. There's a list from ASHRAE. There's been a lot of other organizations that have tried to compile some recommendations. The top things are filtration, outside air ventilation rates. There is some concern about what is it, the stagnant water in your heating system and Legionella. There are some things that you need to definitely be concerned about as you bring buildings back online. So I can't certainly list all the things, but certainly ventilation, filtration, and your operating hours, scheduling, things like that. People are starting 2 hours before, shutting down 2 hours after occupants come in. So there are some things that are good recommendations that people should refer to. And we certainly have that. I'll send that out and make sure anybody that wants it from LinkedIn can have our document.
Okay. So we're right at 1 o'clock, and I know that there's a lot of questions. You said Britain, and I hate to do this to everyone, but I also want to be respectful of our panelists' time. Thank you so much for joining us. I think what we can do is we can take all of the questions that the audience submitted and share them with our panelists, and maybe try and get some responses when we publish the recording of the video, and share that with the folks who attended. So hopefully we can get some answers, but it's been really, I loved preparing for this webinar with you guys, and you're like I said, all inspiring work that you're doing, and bringing really great perspective to the situation we're in. I've appreciated today's discussion. It was lively, and I just want to thank you for doing this for us today. And thank you to the audience for tuning in.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now.